Denizens, good day. Our discussion here revolves around cultures of splendor and power, the European Enlightenment. We're going to talk about Europeans becoming enlightened and try to understand just what it means exactly to be enlightened. And the picture here that you see is the salon of Marie-Therese Rodet-Geoffroy. And it's interesting. In other words, a female running this salon, not as in like a hairdressing salon, but a salon as in basically the French term for your living room. And basically what would happen is you had women in France who would host these intellectual folk to come in and discuss ideas. And this is actually the beginning of something we call the public sphere, where basically people are meeting in public to discuss ideas, everything from science to politics. And prior to this, that was verboten. That was something that you did not do out of fear of reprisals from the king. So we're starting to see by the late 16 and into the 1700s, people beginning to meet publicly and think, at least in their minds, scientifically. And out of this scientific thinking, by the time we get into the 1700s, they will begin to apply scientific rationales into political rationales, which will suddenly challenge the existence of absolutism. So what is enlightenment? We'll talk about this on the morrow, but be thinking about, how do you know when you're enlightened? And what would an enlightened society actually look like? Would it be modern? Okay, then what is modern? What exactly does that mean? Or is it advanced? Not really sure what that means either. And what would be the opposite of enlightenment? If I don't know, does that mean I'm not enlightened? So basically, this European Enlightenment, thinkers were looking to change people's worldviews and to change political institutions. And the people leading this Enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, or François-Marie Auré, they sought to, quote-unquote, spread the light and change the way that societies were governed, how societies were ordered. And one of the biggest things that Enlightenment thinkers wanted to achieve was to use talent as the basis of social status. In other words, people should gain a high level in society, according to Enlightenment thinkers, based upon their own personal accomplishments and skilled abilities, as opposed to, say, just being noble and therefore getting all the benefits of society. And the philosophes, as they were called in France, basically philosophers, a lot of these guys weren't exactly wealthy folk, so they needed the patronage, in other words, the support of the wealthy merchant and middle to upper business class. So basically, it's the wealthy people supporting these great thinkers in their endeavors, which eventually challenges the social and political order. And like we said in the intro, this is the start of a public sphere. Basically, people would meet in cafes where they were consuming a new beverage that was all the rage, coffee. And they would also meet in these intellectual salons, as I pointed out. We're starting to see newspapers, a lot of correspondence, letters between peoples, public theaters, book publishing, all of this stuff starting to come out and enter into this public sphere. And these thinkers, they don't have any respect for the old classical or medieval quote-unquote wisdom. They want to challenge the order with their new line of thinking. So these Enlightenment thinkers, they sought universal objective knowledge, objective as opposed to subjective. In other words, they thought that they could come up with knowledge that applied to all people all around the planet, regardless of culture or political differences, religious differences, racial differences. None of those things mattered in their minds. To them, the knowledge that they had was, or would be, so pure and so ideal that it would just be universally applicable. So even if they ran into aliens in the universe, but nonetheless, knowledge that, would not be dependent upon religious faith, political views, class, or gender, right? They thought that their knowledge would cross all those boundaries. Ironically, their knowledge is actually going to increase the distance in those boundaries and draw all kinds of borders and create all kinds of chaos. And obviously, most of these ideas are going to circulate around commercial and port cities. That's where people are going to interact, right? And these people also believe that they could formulate these quote-unquote natural laws, right? Just laws that everyone should just understand because it's just the natural order of things. The problem is, and the problem always is, who actually defines what is natural and what is quote-unquote normal? And what a lot of these people didn't realize was that their ideas were pretty much biased. They were European, they were upper class, they were white, they were male. So really these people didn't know what they thought they knew. But what do you know? So on top of all this, Europeans continued to believe that their culture was unique, it was superior, right? That it was the standard by which everyone else on the planet should be judged. And here we're talking about where did this enlightenment come from, right? What are the origins of this enlightenment? And really the foundation is the scientific revolution, which we'll talk about here in a second. But just to give you kind of an overview. So what else had caused this curiosity? Well, the trade and conquest, right? The coming into the Americas, people coming into interaction with new peoples and more goods led to a lot of curiosity about the world, right? How religions are organized, how they work, how governments are organized, how they work. And increasingly too, doctors, lawyers, merchants, entrepreneurs, wealthy people, they begin to gain a sense of, hey, wait a second, I'm actually valuable to society and the social order, but we have a king who wants to completely control everything I do. That's going to be a problem. And on top of that, people in the 15 and 1600s, they were tired of the old order, the feudalistic order, but even more so, it seems like there was just this constant state of war amongst the European powers, politically, religiously, just this incessant conflict. And to these Enlightenment thinkers, this just wasn't a necessary means for life. But obviously to absolute monarchs, this is a mercantilism era. So under mercantilism, they're going to war to basically steal other people's resources. Enlightenment thinkers and, beyond even Enlightenment thinkers, where we're talking just the middle class and some of these educated peoples who were not royal or noble, they don't see any benefit to this type of absolutist mercantile order. Ooh, that sounded good. But nonetheless, so basically, religious wars of destruction, plagues, conflicts between dynasties, political dynasties, famine, it created this kind of longing, right? This desire amongst not just the middle class, but also amongst the aristocrats to turn away from the old ways. You have to understand that, there's a lot of nobles and aristocrats also taking part in this enlightenment, which of course would undermine their own power. And increasingly, people are making enough money without needing a king, right? And you got these smart intellectual folk who need the patronage of wealthy individuals. But, these people making their own money and having their own ideas, why do they need a king? Okay, the foundation of this is the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution really stems from new ways of observing and trying to understand the world. Some of your foundational thinkers like Galileo Galilei, Sir Isaac Newton, they really began with Bacon's approach. Bacon was this basically educator, but philosopher as well, from England. And basically he said, look, here's how you need to understand things that are in front of you. You have to observe, you have to experiment, you have to develop a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis. And not to see if that hypothesis is wrong, or not to see if that hypothesis is right, but to see if it's wrong. And if it's not, then it becomes an operational theory. Nonetheless, and of course, that's the scientific method, right? And basically, these scientists began to identify natural laws of their own that govern the universe. Now, their natural laws, though, are a little bit different than the social natural laws that were created by the Enlightenment thinkers, right? Scientists develop natural laws that govern the universe, thinking more in terms of things like gravity, right, or the movement of objects in space. So basically taking this mechanistic view of nature, that nature is a machine, and we know what machines do. They repeat. They do the same thing over and over, right? So if you observe the sun coming up and setting, well, there must be some type of natural law governing that, right? And as commerce continued to expand, right, trade around the world continued to expand, more and more people had more wealth. There was more wealth available then for more research. And two, people are coming into contact with new flora and fauna, plants and animals, new people, new histories, new historical experiences, all these new things, and all these new things that need new explanations. And believe it or not, many monarchs, kings, they called them enlightened despots. Many of these guys actually supported these scientific endeavors and even created their own royal academies of science. So there is Francis Bacon, really the father of the scientific method. And then one of my favorite guys of all time, René Descartes. We'll talk about him, thinking, therefore being, on the morrow. And some of the other very prominent scientific thinkers of the time, Isaac Newton, helped define the laws of gravity, how planets move, this type of thing. Robert Boyle, I'm sure if you read his description, many of you will love him. And Galileo Galilei, who basically proved heliocentric theory, the theory that the Earth goes around the sun, not vice versa. And he's going to get into all kinds of trouble for that crazy theory. And there he is getting in trouble for that crazy theory. Galileo will be put on trial, and the church is going to have some major issues with his theory. And we'll discuss this more in depth as a class. Okay, so this new science, the new science is going to help to increase literacy in Europe. And literacy, of course, was very much on the rise anyway because of the printing press from the middle of the 15th century and the discovery of the New World and this yearning to learn more stuff. And, everyone from farmers to military leaders are using this new scientific approach to improve their jobs, their methods of doing things. But the problem is the emergence of the scientific worldview was uneven at best, right? First of all, religious ideas still very much dominated the thinkings of most people, right? Because the folks who are, experiencing and participating in this scientific revolution, for that matter, the Enlightenment, they're people who are literate. Literacy rates in Europe were not exactly high during this time, right? And of course, you still have local customs and traditions. Most areas are still going to be practicing those things as well. So the poor, most women, they're illiterate, so they're not participating in this, right? And a lot of governments also try to censor any type of view that they see as threatening, right? So the government is also trying to shut down some of these things that might threaten the power of the king, especially in France. But emanating out of this scientific revolution then comes this intellectual movement, more about, instead of about the hard sciences, like biology or chemistry or physics, instead on philosophies of how to exist and philosophies on governing people and how societies work. And some of these thinkers that emerge are folks like Francois-Marie Arouet, who went by a pen name, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a very prominent thinker in France who was also a jerk, and before them, really the father of this intellectual thinking, especially for politics and society, John Locke. You see down there on the left, good old Johnny Locke. And then a Frenchman in the 1700s, Denis Diderot, who invents something called the Encyclopédie. Yeah, the encyclopedia. And, it's the major cities like London and Paris, that's where a lot of this intellectualism, this thinking and pondering of things is going down. And, the sad thing about the Enlightenment is that it's pretty much a male-dominated field. Yeah, we talked about women running some of these salons, right? But the fact of the matter is that women were not really trusted with scientific endeavors, which is hugely unfortunate because the fact of the matter is they were brilliant, brilliant women like Shelley Lemon that you see here. She understood Newtonian physics. She translated into French Newton's works. I mean, she was a genius. The problem was she wasn't given access to the public sphere because she was not a male. And it's one of my favorite quotes from the Enlightenment comes from Voltaire. Voltaire, who got along with her rather well. He said, "She was a great man whose only fault was in being a woman." So these Enlightenment thinkers, they had this scientific approach, right? But the problem with these Enlightenment thinkers is that they thought that they could perfect humanity, that they could perfect mankind. And think a little forward into history, all the way into the 20th century, and begin to think, the Enlightenment could actually be the root of a lot of issues that are going to arise. Nonetheless, Voltaire attacked things like, torture of criminals. Voltaire attacked the church. Voltaire attacked corruption in government. Voltaire was, you can understand why he used a pen name instead of his real name because of some of the inflammatory things that he said. Denis Diderot, author of the Encyclopedia, the guy who put all the stuff together, we'll talk about that in a second. He, stood up against French absolutism. We're going to get another guy in 1776 who's going to publish a very prominent book on the wealth of nations, Adam Smith, who's going to criticize mercantilism and say, you know what, the real way for money and wealth to be created and obtained is actually through a free market. And basically, Enlightenment thinkers, they trusted nature, they trusted human reason, they distrusted institutions, and they distrusted traditions. See any issues with that line of thought? Nonetheless, thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of his big quotes, "Man is born good, it is society that corrupts him." Let me know how that works. Enlightened thinkers railed against superstition, for example. There is Madame Geoffrance Salon, for example. And, the Enlightenment in Europe, although so many aristocrats, they patronize Enlightenment thinkers, many philosophers rejected the social distinctions based on birth. In other words, many of these aristocrats, these nobles, are actually supporting their own demise. And, thinkers like John Locke, really one of the first of these Enlightenment thinkers in the late 1600s, he argued that, look, man is born tabula rasa, in other words, with a blank slate, and that blank slate is there to be written upon, that people can learn and become rational individuals. You did have a few male philosophers like Voltaire who believed in gender equality, but sadly, for the most part, these guys were a bunch of misogynists. They were not nice folk, quite frankly. And a lot of these thinkers, too, they urged religious toleration. Some of these thinkers were agnostic. Some of them were total atheists. Others were what we call deists, which we'll talk about that here later as well. So you have particular types of these thinkers. One type is a physiocrat. A physiocrat is an Enlightenment thinker who deals with economics. And the ultimate example of this, I think, from the Enlightenment is Adam Smith. Adam Smith talked about how free enterprise, in other words, a free market, no government regulations, or what he called laissez-faire, meaning hands off. In other words, the government should not be involved in the economy. He said, look, it's actually the invisible hand of self-interest that guides the most efficient use of resources for a nation's economy, right? And public welfare will increase. It will become more prosperous by the government getting out of the way. State as in government and personal efforts to promote social good, he said, are ineffectual compared to just unbridled, in other words, just letting the market run itself? Be thinking about that too. Any kinds of problems that could also arise with that. Um, and, he based his thinking on Enlightenment thoughts that these universal laws of human behavior justified free markets because they allowed human nature to express itself completely and fully. And this basically, Adam Smith lays the foundation for free trade and capitalism, which European powers will claim to practice, but in practice will not practice it. So basically then, these philosophers believe that they quote unquote discovered these laws of human behavior, right? Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations talking about these universal economic laws, stressing unregulated markets, no government interference or very limited, that the invisible hand of the market would, basically overall give prosperity and thus social peace to everyone. But also it played into this idea that, well, you know what, the only ones who could truly understand a free market and capitalism are the Europeans because they're the only ones who are smart enough. So basically, non-European peoples in the European minds, they believed that Europe would have to, or rather that other peoples would have to imitate Europe and organize themselves according to the quote-unquote natural laws. That is, the natural laws that the Europeans are thinking of. And one of the most famous works coming out of this Enlightenment in Europe is the Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia basically was a collection of essays, basically from intellectuals. Still remember the door-to-door encyclopedia salesman. Ooh, and Funkin' Wagnall encyclopedias from Kroger. Good stuff. Nonetheless, the encyclopedia was really, yes, it had factual information. I mean, everything from, how governments function and operate to how to make a pin in a factory. But it was also subjective, in other words, opinionated. It's criticizing European society. It's praising the superiority of European culture over all others. And a lot of these thinkers called for a cultural hierarchy, right? In other words, smart people at the top based on their skill sets, based on what they have accomplished as opposed to their family lineage or bloodline. And in this cultural hierarchy, free trade and rationalism should run the show. But remember, it's rationalism based upon how the Europeans or what they perceive as rational. And basically, the Europeans looked at other social orders according to how well they met these European standards. So that's what's funny, even though they kind of acknowledge the accomplishments of other societies, like China, inventing basically, everything, they viewed themselves as Europe taking the lead because the Europeans are so sophisticated. No one could possibly match them. There's Diderot, Encyclopedia. Encyclopedia was banned in France. And there you go. There's pin making in the encyclopedia, like I said earlier, for example, right? The idea of the encyclopedia was you're going to gather all the knowledge that's scattered over the face of the earth, right? And put it into one set of books, right? So you have easy access. I mean, this was their internet, right? And the idea was to portray it as this kind of universal knowledge, right? And even non-European religious faiths were portrayed negatively. Christianity, not so much. It's not that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't appreciate Christianity. What they didn't appreciate was any type of corrupt or corrupted version of it emanating from humans. We'll talk more about that later as well. But nonetheless, these people evaluated the world's regions, other cultures, according to their Enlightenment standards. And here, for example, is Voltaire. Voltaire, who would criticize aristocracy, also benefited from it, right? He moved easily into aristocratic circles. He met with kings and queens. He would dine at their tables. He corresponded with monarchs, and he was criticized for this, right? Because he's supposed to be railing against this type of system. but he's kind of caught in the middle because you also need to eat. But Voltaire, he opposed tyranny, he opposed dogma, religious teachings for the most part, and he didn't really want to have any type of tyrannical order, any type of absolutist order. That being said, he had almost no faith in the ordinary person. Voltaire thought everybody was pretty much too stupid to be able to kind of run their own affairs and to be amazing thinkers like he was. That was sarcasm. So basically, he thought that educated and sophisticated people could, through the exercise of their reason, that they could see the world and it could help to improve it. That being said, only certain people could do this, according to him. And one of his major adversaries was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had faith in the common man, except for women. Rousseau was a complete misogynist. He viewed women as incapable of reason. So both of these guys definitely have their shortcomings. Rousseau, for example, he opposed the theater, which was Voltaire's lifeblood. Voltaire was a playwright, wrote books. Rousseau shunned the aristocracy, while Voltaire courted it. He depended upon it, right? And Voltaire, he argued for basically democratic revolution, where hey, people take over, except for women. Whereas Voltaire said, you put these common people in charge, these yokels will be doomed. So basically, Voltaire argued that equality was impossible. Rousseau argued that inequality was unnatural. Voltaire charmed with his wit. Rousseau, who was kind of curmudgeon-y, he always claimed to be right. Of course. Voltaire insisted on the supremacy of intellect, whereas Rousseau kind of emphasized emotions. Voltaire, he would always kind of repeat the same handful of Enlightenment core ideas, whereas Rousseau would spark off original thoughts in all kinds of directions. Rousseau was kind of this ADHD Enlightenment thinker, right? He's talking about education, family, government, whatever else came to his attention at the time. And, interestingly, for all their differences, they actually had a lot in common, more than they would ever like to admit. They viewed absolute monarchy as dangerous. They rejected basically Orthodox Christianity, at least the way that it was presented to them. Rousseau was pretty much as much a skeptic as Voltaire. They both shared in the idea more of deism, and deism was this kind of religious approach that many Enlightenment thinkers took on, including Enlightenment thinkers in the Americas like Ben Franklin or maybe Thomas Jefferson, though he's kind of odd, where basically they believed in a deity, they believed in God. But what deists claimed, that's where you get deism, deity, was that, hey, God put everything in motion, got everything started, but then God stepped away and left humans to their own devices. So in other words, God is not involved in everyday human life at all, according to these thinkers. And that's how a deist would think. So a deist believes in God. They just don't believe that God is any longer attentive to humanity. And of course, politically, on the global scale, it's always England versus France by the time we roll into the 1700s, right? In England, who had gotten its revolution out of the way early. Remember, they go through the Glorious Revolution in 1689, right? So they're able to proceed, more smoothly down this road to a more democratic type of government, whereas France is going to have some major issues. And when English liberty, the ideas of English liberty, when they get transported to France, it is going to be dynamite. It is going to explode France into one of the worst, bloodiest, nastiest revolutions in human history. And of course, remember, the Americas, under the control of the British Crown, these Enlightenment ideas are going to cross across the Atlantic by the early to mid 1700s. And people like Jefferson, to an extent George Washington, but definitely Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, a guy who is actually going to end his citizenry of being a British citizen and say that he basically is an American citizen when he moves to New York. These guys are all powerfully influenced by Enlightenment thought. And, it's interesting, the God who underwrites the concept of equality in the American Declaration of Independence is the same deist God who Rousseau would have worshipped in the minds of American Enlightenment thinkers. And the American Revolution itself, which we'll delve into later on, but just an overview, the American Revolution, it borrows all of the language of the Enlightenment, ideas of natural law, of inherent freedoms, in other words, freedoms that you are born with, inalienable rights, right? Self-determination, that people should be able to determine how to run their lives and their governments. This stuff spreads like wildfire in the Americas. And on top of that, separated geographically from most of the aristocrats against whom they were rebelling, the American Revolution didn't need to be nearly as radical or as corrosive as the one that will be in France. Remember, the Americans have a huge degree of separation, right? The Atlantic Ocean's a big place, especially in the 1700s. So they're very much separated from their overseers, their rulers. Whereas in France, that's not going to be the case. And that's going to make for a very nasty revolution in France. And the Enlightenment in Europe, you also have kings and queens who are these so-called enlightened despots. In other words, they kind of take a different approach to these Enlightenment ideas. Instead of like in France with, one of the King Louis smashing Enlightenment ideas saying this threatens my power, you get people like Frederick the Great, Nodas, Dazi, Nodas, who say, look, we can use Enlightenment ideas to actually help make our government more efficient. And if we have a more efficient government and political system, people are less likely to rebel. On top of that, some of these Enlightenment ideas can be used militarily, politically, socially, culturally, economically, and we can make money off of this, right? So people like Catherine the Great over in Russia or Frederick the Great in Prussia, don't get confused there, we'll talk about that. They kind of got it. They both met with the likes of Voltaire, for example, and corresponded with him. And they understood that, there needed to be some change in order for them to survive, but also that they can manipulate those ideas to manipulate their own people. And here you can see the places where some of these ideas will take off. And you see some other names there too. Some of these other Enlightenment thinkers who you may come across in some of our primary document readings. So basically, when we're all done with this, you should be able to discuss the major themes of Enlightenment thought. You APers out there, we actually have another part of this where we'll talk about the Chinese and Japanese governments and how they try to control culture and knowledge. And also for you APers, we'll be talking about Oceania and how the Europeans are going to affect places like Australia. But that wraps it up for Cultures of Splendor and Power 1, y'all. Thanks for listening in. Adios.